Weather and life both change quickly. Do you have a farm estate plan? You need to learn the best option to help your family avoid or minimize federal estate taxes and other costs.
I'm Brad Swenson, President of Swenson Investments in Commodities. We work confidentially with farmers, ranchers, and advisors to help develop the best farm estate plan.
We've spent a lot of time talking about tiling on farms over the last few years on Ag PhD, and one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that people think that tiling is going to add to flooding problems, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We're going to talk about that today during our Farm Basics time.
It's funny, turning on a drainage tile hose is not like turning on a hydrant. You may see some water coming out of there, but it's not creating new water. This is one of the confusions that I see a lot with non-farmers in general, but also some farmers. They think, well, wait a minute now, would that water be getting to the river anyway?
Well, of course it would, because water flows downhill. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the water's moving on the surface of the soil or if it's moving subsurface, water's always moving and it's always moving downhill. That's just the way it goes. So the big thing to make sure that we're clear on is, as long as when tiling is done, it's not taking water from one watershed and moving it to another watershed, as long as it's keeping it in the same watershed, there's no new water that's added. Okay, yes, it's going to change the timing on when the water gets there. For the most part, it's going to slow things down. So in other words, it's going to reduce peak flow of water, and university studies have proven this over time. You usually have a reduction in peak flow by 15 to 30%. And you think about the reason why, it's very simple. Okay, if you have 100% saturated soil, like a lot of times we have in the spring because it was wet in the fall, we have the winter time. Well, in the spring, we've got soils that are 100% saturated. Okay, where do you think the snow melt and new rainfall is going to go? Well, it has no choice but to run off the field. When you have tile in the field, now you've lowered the water table, that's all we're doing, and now a lot of that water can get absorbed in the spring instead of having to run off. So thereby, we're reducing flooding problems, not increasing them.
A lot of the tile lines that farmers are putting in our part of the world are going in at about 3-foot depth. Now, at 3-foot depth, we're going to control that water table and move it down to about 3 feet. But is that even going to be running in the early spring?
Well, a lot of times it's not. Just as an example, a couple years ago on our own farm, there was some flooding going on in our area, and right away people were thinking, oh boy, you farmers who are tiling are contributing to the flooding problems. And I just said, come out to our farm. In fact, we'll take some pictures and video. Our tile lines aren't even running. They're froze up. And that happens a lot of winters when we have a relatively open winter. That frost goes down well into the ground, 4 or 5 feet deep, and it freezes up our tile lines. So we didn't have any tile lines running until early May a couple years ago when the frost finally came out of the ground.
When we talk about those tile lines freezing up in the winter, I actually had a guy that I work with had his basement flooded in February, and he said, wait a minute now, you talk about tile lines freezing. Mine didn't freeze around my house, but they're around the outside of his basement, which is 8 feet deep. Now, 8 feet down in the soil, I don't care how cold it gets outside, we're probably not going to freeze that far down. That's deeper than even our water lines in our part of the world. So those tile lines were running all the time, and when we had some early spring melting, they had water in those tile lines, and his sump pump wasn't working. Boom, he had a problem.
Well, once again, when we talk about tiling, and if farmers are doing this right, then tiling is not going to add to flooding problems. It's not going to add new water into the system or anything like that, because again, water's always flowing downhill, whether it's above surface or below surface. But the whole point is we can spread out the time of when we're moving that water, and a lot of times we can get rid of water in the fall when our rivers are lower anyway. Then we have a much bigger reservoir to hold water in the spring because we've lowered the water table out in great big fields. So if we do this as farmers, then we can reduce flooding problems around the country. It's a good thing for everybody.
Well, one of the bad things people don't think about with floods is they can spread weed seeds, and weeds like our Weed of the Week could take over your flooded ground. We'll talk about this week's weed later in the show.